If you developed a time machine and could go back in time, would you kill Adolf Hitler? The assumption, based on my experience, that most American students really have very little knowledge about Islam in general. When it began, where it began, relating it obviously to, the Prophet Muhammad, it becomes an experience of the world where the body almost doesn't matter, if that makes sense. You're no longer a body, you're just a mind floating in space. So I don't want to be sort of alarmist and say that artificial intelligence is going to end humanity. I actually did write two articles for Wikipedia. The difference is that AI is potentially autonomous technology. So it's the first technology that can make decisions without human input.
The following conversation with Professor Matthew Smith, a historian specializing in American religious history, Appalachia, and the Ohio Valley. He teaches courses on American Revolution, the early American Republic, and broader scope of world and U.S. history at Miami University, where he also completed his Ph.D. in history. Dr. Matthew's research explores the intricate tapestries of transatlantic immigration and its impact on regional developments. His publications delve into various historical moments, from pandemics to religious transformation in Cincinnati and the surrounding areas, reflecting a deep engagement with how past events shape our understanding of the present. In addition to his academic pursuits, Matthew has led a significant project funded by institutions like NEH, focusing on topics such as the historical dialogues of war veterans and the cultural significance of bluegrass music in Southwest Ohio. He's recipient of multiple fellowship and grant, highlighting the contributions to historical scholarship and community engagement. This conversation explores those topics and more, uncovering the layers of history that influence today's societal dynamics. My mission is to get humans and myself to the truth, deeply understand the universe and the world around us. We explore every idea, thought, and point of view. We go through every detail in every aspect, from quantum particles to massive black holes. We explore and understand everything as possible. If you believe that everyone should be aware of this, join me. Share this channel with your friends and important people. Be my mate on this mission. Let's get to the most truth together. So, Professor, what first interests me, and what are some most significant events back in history, which impacted or influenced this current world? So the event which shaped current world significantly influenced them.
So thanks first of all, Ali, for having me on the podcast. I think this is a great project.
Thank you.
So again, if we're talking about events, I think most people, when they think of history, because of the way we've been educated, we think of a timeline. I always think of like an arrow pointing from the past to the future.
Yes.
And along the line, there are certain events which, like you suggest in your question, are turning points, or are shaping the world we live in today. But I would say, obviously events matter, events are important. But really, the world we live in is shaped not so much by events as by phenomena. And I will explain just very simply for the audience what I mean by the distinction between events and phenomena. So an event could be something like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which triggered the First World War. But if you say the First World War, a war that millions of Europeans and people in the Middle East in the old Ottoman Empire died during this war that was caused by the death of a single man, that doesn't really go to the root of cause of explaining why nations and empires went to war in 1914 through 1918. So that's just one example. So you're looking at the phenomena in that case would be the rise of a sort of technological imperial arms race between great powers. So I would say the phenomena which have shaped the history of the world more than any other are not events, they're not individuals. A better example than the one I gave would be Christopher Columbus discovering America in 1492.
Yeah.
So that, of course, was an important event. But if Christopher Columbus hadn't discovered America because of the pressures that were building in Europe, some other explorer or some other seafarer would have discovered America at some point from some other part of the world. So to understand the importance of 1492, which is the year of the discovery of America by Europeans, historians sometimes refer to what is referred to as the Columbian Exchange, which was the exchange of plants, animals, diseases, cultures, human populations from the Eastern and Western Hemisphere, which had been cut off from each other for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And so you can understand for the average, Mayan or the average Italian peasant in 1492, the discovery of America, although historians would look back and say that was a turning point, that was a key event, that wouldn't have had much impact on their life. What might have had impact was the introduction of diseases such as smallpox into your community that might have, had a devastating impact on populations of Native Americans, or in the case of Europeans, the Italian peasant would have had access for the first time, not immediately, but generations down the road, to new sources of food, potatoes, tomatoes. Foods that were coming from the old world or to the old world from the new world. So you were seeing a shaping of environment, shaping of living conditions, shaping of human populations, and of course, the great dying of American Indians, the immigration from the old world, from Europe, and also the Atlantic slave trade are going to shape the foundations of the society we've become. So that would be one example where you could look at the event being Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World, but the phenomenon is globalization, if you like, and that can be understood politically, but also ecologically, economically, culturally. So to go back to your question, I would say the big ones would be the end of the last ice age, the development of agriculture, so the farming revolution. And again, that's not an event because that's a series of experimentation and early farmers, hunter-gatherers, selectively breeding crops and animals over successive generations, settling in more sedentary rather than nomadic styles of life. And that took place over probably hundreds, if not thousands of years. But obviously, without agriculture, there is no civilization. So the agricultural revolution would be the big one. I would say on top of that, maybe the industrial revolution, which has only been around for about 250 years, but which is really an energy revolution because we're still living in the age of the fossil fuel revolution. Yeah. So people have been burning coal for thousands of years, but to harness it in steam power and to kind of develop steel rail technology, steamships that are capable of traveling around the world in a way that was much more efficient than the old sailing ships that took Christopher Columbus across the Atlantic Ocean. So I would say, if I had to boil it down to three big events, I would say agricultural revolution, discovery of the New World, which is what the Europeans called America, and which is a landmark in terms of globalization, and then shortly after that, the Industrial Revolution. So those are three big ones.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting because sometimes people tend to think that even some specific events shaped our current world, but so this events doesn't affect that much. So if talking about the individuals, in your opinion, what do you think the major person or human which changed environment or current world dramatically, which influenced that way that we are living right now?
That's a great question. So this is one that historians debate, and there is no consensus because in some ways you're asking a historical question. In some ways you're also asking a philosophical question, which is how much does the individual shape history? Are we shaped by our environment, or do we shape our environment? And it's a two-way street, perhaps, but which is the key direction of the flow? And I try and introduce this in sort of ways with my students, because I'm also a teacher, in a way that they can understand the question without being sort of overwhelmed by the philosophical aspect of it. And sometimes I do play sort of little thought experiments and so on. So I have we've just been doing the Second World War, of course.
Yeah.
So I have a photograph of Adolf Hitler when he was a baby. And the thought experiment, I'm not, for the audience, I'm not in any way advocating child murder. But the question is, and I'm trying to make a very heavy subject, which is the Nazis, but using that as an example of the influence of individuals. So even where you have a very heavy subject, I think sometimes you still need to approach it in a way that can relate to people's general understanding. So I say, if you were a time traveler, if you developed a time machine and could go back in time, I emphasize this is a thought experiment. This is not reality. Would you kill Adolf Hitler? Yeah, and that and the reason I ask that is not, partly I have a dark sense of humor, but there is a serious point there. Is that I don't think anyone would say, as a baby, Adolf Hitler was guilty of the acts that he would commit later in life. But the question is, if you remove him from the picture of history, does the Holocaust still happen? Does World War II still happen? Do the Nazis still happen? So my point is, perhaps we put too much emphasis on the individual, and sometimes as well try to rationalize their actions by saying, well, maybe Hitler had an unhappy childhood. But and certainly I do regard Hitler as an evil individual and someone who had a big impact, negative impact on history. But I think as well, you can look at the Nazi phenomenon, again, not the event of Hitler's birth, but the Nazi phenomenon, and look at the people surrounding Hitler. Himmler, Goering, Goebbels, some of these Nazi leaders who were part of that inner circle. And some of them were at least as crazy as Hitler. And Hitler himself was radicalized by association with these individuals and his own life experiences. And of course, in the case of Hitler, you were talking about, although Germany between the First and Second World Wars was very politically unstable, and there were a lot of abuses that took place. Nevertheless, Hitler was actually elected to power. So to what extent are the German people who voted for Hitler in 1933 responsible for the events which followed? So my point is not necessarily to conclusively answer the question of whether the individuals shape history, but I think you can say that at the very least, it's a two-way street, that individuals are shaped by their experiences, by their associations, and by their environment. So I'm a little bit, and I probably sound like I'm a little bit sitting on the fence, sort of trying to have it both ways. But it is a very complicated question, the one that you asked. And then some historians are very, very adamant that the individual, people like George Washington, for example, who is described as the indispensable man by his contemporaries. Could someone else have led America during the Revolution? I think there are very few people who had his resume or his characteristics. So I think individuals can make an impact, but I think you also have to weigh that against the environment and the climate of what was going on at the time.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of a non-answer to your question a little bit, but I'm trying to broaden the question. Yep.
That's great. I very liked how you dive into these two. These two, like, why people think that the individuals play a real crucial role, or why you do think that they don't play. So right now, I understood that for me, I got my idea that they actually don't play because it also depends to the environment and to the people at that time and to the events which were occurring at that time. So not that much.
Yeah.
So how do you approach teaching complex historic events to students from diverse backgrounds? Because there are so many international students, there are so many students from like various beliefs, like Muslims, Christians, and other. So sometimes there are like very controversial topics, maybe according their nationality, according their beliefs. And some nations think this event that way, but others think it was that way.
Yeah. That's actually a great question, and also I know you were a student in my class as well, so you have some experience. But I would say, first of all, I'm very glad that I teach a very diverse student audience at Miami University here on the Hamilton campus, because I think as a teacher, it makes me reflect on presentation of ideas which I might think from my own background are common knowledge or common reference points. And then I think, for example, a student from Uzbekistan or a student from China, if the situation was reversed, what do I know about Chinese history? What do I know? Probably even less about the history of Uzbekistan. So these are bright students, but they've also been educated in different systems, and of course, your national perspective, your geographic perspective, always shapes your understanding of the world, and very powerfully so. So I try to think this is something that also benefits not just the international students in the class, but the entire class, because I find a lot of American students as well, when I make these assumptions about what they would or would not know, just as a matter of common knowledge, that very often I'm surprised by what I have to explain, and sometimes it's geographic, sometimes because I also grew up in a different country. I grew up in the United Kingdom, but sometimes it's also generational. So, for example, I talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall. I remember watching that on television as a young middle school, high schooler growing up, the end of communism. And yet, to students who were born after 9/11, for example, the fall of the Berlin Wall is ancient history. So, the significance of, the end of the Soviet Union or the fall of East Germany needs to be put into a bigger context. So with the international students, you mentioned a couple of examples there. One is I do, again, I'm not a specialist on Islamic history. At the Miami University regional campus, we have a very sort of close-knit faculty, so we teach a lot of material that covers a lot of ground. So I do teach world history, though, and I am a historian of religion. That's one of my fields. So when it comes to world history, I do introduce Islamic culture into the classroom as part of my survey class. And what I try to start off with is just the assumption, based on my experience, that most American students really have very little knowledge about Islam in general. And we're not talking here about religious instruction. We're just talking about, the basic kind of civic knowledge about, one of the major world religions. So I tried my world history class just to kind of give an outline and try not to sort of go too deep into controversies, but just to sort of like, this is what the fundamental beliefs of Islam are. This is how the religion began, when its role in the emergence of Middle Eastern civilization, and then later on, obviously, we do get into more controversial stuff with the Ottoman Empire and things like that. But I think it is a service to students to have a kind of common knowledge, whether you're talking about international students or American students, and having the international student presence in the classroom makes me reflect on how we can tie all that knowledge together in a way that everyone can understand.
Yeah, that's, I think, very interesting. It's like a dance between topics and about, and also opinions, because how you said, every nation, I think, has its own thoughts and opinions about specific events in a world. So it's affected this country, this particular nation, a little bit a different way, maybe, and they had other point of view or just other opinion about this specific event, I guess.
Yeah, and I was speaking the other day actually to, you may know Verhagen, our colleague in Miami, and he's a professor here, mathematician who grew up in Armenia, in fact, in the old Soviet Union, and he emigrated to the United States in the 1990s. And we were talking about history, and it was very interesting to hear from his perspective the knowledge of history that he grew up with in Armenia, which was the old Soviet system. And so, we're talking about World War II, for example.
Yeah.
In America, most kids today, maybe their grandparents or even their great-grandparents were that generation, but they know World War II through Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers. But from what Verhagen was saying, the Soviet education system, it was Stalin saved the world from Hitler. So it's a very different, and of course, I'm sure they were aware of the bigger picture, but the emphasis that's placed is very specific to time and place.
Yeah, mostly when I was young, about 12 or 14 years old, just kid, asking about World War II from my parents and from people around, they tend to think that it was just war between us and Germans.
Yeah,
but actually there was many countries involved and there were many events. I think not many people from my country knows about the Hiroshima and the same with the American, Japanese and American actions at that time. Not that much, because they're mostly specialized in, I think they heard that from their parents, and from their parents told them about their parents, because it's more specific to our country.
Yeah.
That's great. Professor, how do you, can you share an example of historical event or period of time that you believe is commonly misunderstood, or misrepresented?
Yes, I have a good example with, I don't know if, I know you mentioned the Luddites in our conversation before this podcast.
Yeah.
Would you like me to get to that? Yes.
That would be great.
Okay. So the word Luddite.
Okay.
This is a word, I don't know if you're familiar with this word, Ali.
I wasn't before your classes, but during your class I learned what is it about.
Okay, so the Luddites, this is a word, and again, this is another example of cultural specific knowledge. So when I was growing up in the United Kingdom, the word Luddite was very common. So you refer to someone as a Luddite, everyone knows what you mean. And there, again, the history had been forgotten, but the word had sort of remained kind of like a shell.
Okay.
And people understood the idea through the word rather than through the history. But what I find is in America, even though the word Luddite is used, it tends to be very exotic. It's not a word that's widely understood. So, and I know this by speaking to my students in a history classroom. So, in a nutshell, the Luddite movement, it was a movement named for a guy called Ned Ludd, Ludd, and his followers were called Luddites.
Okay.
Now, Ned Ludd is kind of like a Robin Hood figure, another culturally specific reference. But he was a figure who probably existed, but he's not well documented. He was an obscure figure of the period of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. So here we're talking the United Kingdom, late 18th century, early 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
So around the sort of early 1800s. And the Luddites, what they were was an organized movement which used, frankly, physical violence and machine sabotage, destroying machine equipment, factories, as a form of resistance to the economic impact of the Industrial Revolution. Now, so the term Luddite is used now in a very loose way. So it's not, if I was to call you a Luddite, and I know you're not a Luddite because I can see your equipment, but if I was to call you a Luddite, most people would understand that to mean not that Ali is going to take a hammer and go to the nearest technology, Apple store and smash everything up, but someone who is maybe like myself. I still have a flip phone, for example. I'm a late adopter of technology. I'm hesitant and sort of suspicious of artificial intelligence, and so there's a sort of sense of anti-technology or resistance to technology. So the Luddites, I would say, are misunderstood, partly because of the historical stereotype. These were just a bunch of uneducated peasants who were trying to resist progress in the sense that we understand it, technological progress, through violence. Now, that's sort of a myth. It's kind of half true, so there's an element of truth to it. But the Luddites were a very fascinating group. So the Luddites are a good example of a cohort in a generation that were skilled workers. They were well paid. They were actually what we would think of as artisans. If you're familiar with the idea of skilled labor, craft labor, these were people who worked in the textile industry, which was part of the British economy for going back to the time of the Roman Empire, frankly. And they were very skilled with the use of technology. And again, this is kind of counter to the idea that we have of this is an anti-technological movement. But the technology was traditional forms of technology. So, for example, hand loom weaving, these very intricate textile techniques that were passed down through an apprentice system, and not in the scale of big factories, industrial productivity, economies of scale, but just what we would call what historians refer to as cottage industry, so sort of household labor. But because their labor was skilled and because they could take their labor with them, they were well compensated for their work by the standards of the time. And so what happens around the late 18th century, and this is really one of the first industries to industrialize on a large scale, was the textile industry starts to become mechanized. And so you have displacement of a lot of these artisans who were located in rural areas, and the jobs are moving to the cities. They're moving from households to factories. They're also moving to a kind of time-based system where people are clocking in and clocking out and working shifts, whereas the old traditional textile weavers and manufacturers had great freedom because they were essentially self-employed. So they had what we would call today flexi time. They could work their own hours. And the other key point here is that the technology of the Industrial Revolution meant that the workers who were in the factories were performing repetitive, sometimes low-skilled tasks, and could be, dismissed very easily. There were no labor unions to protect worker rights in this environment, and were also very poorly paid by comparison with the previous generation of skilled workers. So, again, the Luddites, Ned Ludd himself, was what was described as a stocking weaver. So he was someone who made stockings like socks. He was a young man, probably from the central region of England, and he led basically the first sabotage of some of these machines. He took a sledgehammer and literally, pounded them into pieces. Now, the idea was that very naive, I think, the idea that you can resist technology through physical force. But on top of that, I think there was a critique as well of technology. It wasn't just that they were resisting technology for the sake of resisting technology, but the followers of Ned Ludd were inspired by defending their traditional craft techniques. Also, the idea of kind of organizing as a community against this new technology. And remember, this is so early in the first industrial revolution, that there was no sense that this technology, which had sort of made a foothold, was going to necessarily take root and become, dominant throughout the economy. So what happens is actually this movement then becomes a kind of insurrection in regions of England that were industrializing at that time, and it lasts for probably 10 or 20 years. With quite heavy oppression by the British government. Thousands of troops sent in, ringleaders rounded up. Some of them were hanged. Some of them were sent on ships to prison colonies in Australia as part of the British colonial system at that time. And eventually the movement was put down. But I think to say that this is just simply a kind of mindless response to technological change misses the fact that this was also a very intentional organization by the Luddites. And some of the Luddites as well were quite well educated. These were people who could read and write, who consumed newspapers, political pamphlets, had the skills to organize themselves. And they did actually slow the introduction of the technology probably by a generation. I think the scale of the Industrial Revolution was such that it would have been impossible to prevent that taking place over time. But I think the reason they matter as a movement, the Luddites, not that I would advocate their tactics. I would certainly discourage people from, sort of taking extreme measures. But they are a point where we can relate to the present day. The disruption of new technology in our own time, which is radically different than anything we've seen before. So I think artificial intelligence, for example, some people will say, well, there's no difference between AI technology and the technology of the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. I would say the difference is that AI is potentially autonomous technology. So it's the first technology that can make decisions without human input once it's established. And that makes it different. And that means that for our generation, just for the Luddites, we have to figure out for ourselves what this technology means in relation to our society, our values, our sense of the value of labor, for example. Are we all going to be sitting around, with virtual reality headsets, out of work, but being paid some sort of universal basic income as machines take over the workforce? Or is there an important human element in the economy that we need to defend and maintain? So these are again, historical questions, but I think all historical questions at some point are also philosophical questions. So it's the great value of the humanities is it makes us think about who we are and where we come from and where we're headed. So I try to say history is not just a timeline of names and events, but it's a way of understanding our world.
That's great. You mentioned about the artificial intelligence, about current world, and it's being another. We are right now experiencing fourth revolution of artificial intelligence, revolution of intelligence itself. So we humans are creating human-like intelligence, which can make or like choose, which can do a decision, make a decisions. So what do you think? How do you see the role of technology influencing the study and teaching of global history?
I think it does change the classroom. I haven't figured out for myself yet what that means in terms of my own teaching. So I have to say, again, I'm a historian, and there are also limitations to my training. So being able to adapt in a practical way to this new emerging technology, I think we look also to our institutions for guidance. So I know Miami University at the moment has an artificial intelligence task force, which is going to be very interesting to see how it comes up with recommendations for faculty, for students. But also, I think it changes the dynamic even more so than the advent of the internet. So I remember, I'm old enough. I remember when Wikipedia was a new thing, and the thing I liked about Wikipedia, and I think is still valuable about Wikipedia, is it's a kind of community effort.
Yeah.
So I haven't been involved in writing and editing Wikipedia for many years, but when it was relatively new, I actually did write two articles for Wikipedia. This was when a lot of stuff hadn't yet been written for Wikipedia, and I wrote a couple of sort of biographical, historical articles for Wikipedia. And you can still find those original articles online, but because it's years and years ago, those have been, kind of edited and changed beyond recognition. And, I like that about Wikipedia, because you put in your input and then the community adapts it and changes it. And so for me, it's not a problem to see that, the article that I wrote is now a completely different article. To me, that's actually a good thing, because it shows that this is not just one individual creating knowledge, but this is a community of people creating knowledge. I think the change now is with artificial intelligence, you also have this other form of intelligence, which is part of the mix. And it also, I think, like you suggested, changes the way we understand intelligence in general. What is intelligence? And our own intelligence, and also potentially changes who we are as human beings. So I don't want to be sort of alarmist and say that artificial intelligence is going to end humanity, but it may very well change our understanding of humanity. And especially if we're talking about integration of technology with, our human circuitry, if you like, that has evolved over millions of years. So how it affects the history classroom, I think we have to accept to a certain extent, even though we might resist, kind of like the Luddites, the reality that we're faced with. Thinking about maybe knowledge is something that we need to emphasize is created communally, as a community, rather than just the traditional model of maybe a professor standing at a lecture stand and broadcasting information and the students taking notes and then being tested on that information. I think, once you can say, you can write in policies into your syllabus that say, obviously all work has to be your own work, and, try and avoid using ChatGPT and all the rest of it. But I think eventually that race, it's kind of almost like a technological race, is going to pass into the hands of artificial intelligence. And professors are just going to have to recognize that this is part of the way that knowledge is created. So I think rather than fighting it from the outside, resisting it from within. So again, not necessarily just to sort of go with the flow. I don't want to say that we should just accept that knowledge is just out there and that we are passive consumers. We think of music, for example. For most of human history, music was something that was created by people sitting around a fire, playing instruments, singing songs, passing down from one generation to another. Then with the Industrial Revolution, music becomes something that you purchase at a store or on an app. And I think there's a danger that not knowledge itself becomes a commodity. So I think actually trying to create a kind of classroom environment, and again, this is very abstract the way I'm describing it. I haven't yet quite figured out how this works in my own classroom. I'm still working on the old model. To some extent, we have fun conversations in my classroom, but I think also it has to shape the way that the class is taught. So the idea that knowledge is something that we create as a community. So knowledge is not just facts; it's also interpretation. Is what I'm saying. So history is not just learn, the dates of Joseph Stalin or Napoleon Bonaparte. It's how does this relate to our situation in the stream of time, and how do we as individuals fit into this picture? So I think artificial intelligence is something that is going to impact all of us, whether we're very online or whether we're latter-day Luddites. So I've spoken with some older folks in the community about artificial intelligence. It's very interesting as well to get the generational perspective. And their take is that sometimes, because I know some old folks who don't even have internet or email, and they say, well, I don't understand artificial intelligence. It doesn't really affect me because I don't have computers in my house, and the problem with that, of course, is it might not affect you directly, but it's going to affect everything. Even the grocery store or politics, of course, that's a big one. Yeah.
Yes. I have actually experience, I can say, a little bit Luddite movement during your classes, during the exam. And I very like how you approach taking exams. I mean, testing, examining your students, like using actual paper with actual pen and just in the classroom without anything, just write what's in your mind. So other exams in other classes, they usually be in a canvas, online, just sitting, like a student typing or just test, like picking the test answers. And from my perspective, I don't think it works in a, how you said, with a whole bunch of internet, AI, and everything. So the approaching, the testing, examining the students with just old school paper and pencil, I think is the best solution for other teachers, I guess, to have the knowledge, real knowledge of their students, to just get that.
Yeah. No, and that's the other thing, actually. I obviously agree because but it's not just my opinion, but there's also been a lot of research on how students retain knowledge and how students think. And there's an interesting kind of interface between the body and the mind. And they've actually done research that if students take handwritten notes during a class, they will remember that information more freely than if they just take it on their devices. Because I think there's something about the connection between just having an object at the end of your extension of your body and just sort of typing into a computer. So this is why I find the metaverse a little bit frightening, because I think it becomes an experience of the world where the body almost doesn't matter, if that makes sense. You're no longer a body, you're just a mind floating in space. And so I think if there is a silver lining to artificial intelligence, it actually makes us stop maybe and reconsider what the values are that we share as a community, as a human species, and how we relate to the world in a very physical way, as well as in a technological way.
That's great, Professor. So speaking about the future, so many things from the past, and leaning on this event where these revolutions, what are your hopes and expectations for the future?
That's a great question. There is a whole field of study called futurology.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
We don't offer, as far as I know, futurology at Miami University, but we do offer history. Historians. I think all historians are futurologists in a sort of back to front way, because we think about how the past applies to the present, and if you think about how the past applies to the present, you can't help extending that into the future. But in terms of my hopes for the future. Again, I want to be a little bit guarded because I'm not a futurologist, I'm a historian. But obviously, I'm also a human being.
Yeah.
And I have a daughter who is actually graduating from high school this spring. So she's actually going to be turning 18 next week. So it is, that parenthood also makes me reflect on the future more than if I was just looking at my own future. So I do see, I think, a combination of factors that have shaped this generation, I guess Generation Z, the generation that's coming up into adulthood in the world today. And I think there are a lot of challenges that they face. I think, in some ways, a lot of older adults would say that they've had an easy life. But I don't actually agree. I think, it's actually more difficult to navigate the world for the young generation than it was for my middle-aged generation that would grow up, with payphones and blockbuster video stores. So I think my hope is that actually that the society, the generation that comes up, recovers some sense of community that's been lost through, I think, partly through technology, the idea that we consume information, we consume entertainment, as consumers in a sort of economic sense and also as individuals. So you have, 3 people sitting around a dinner table and everyone's on their phones watching a different movie. It seems funny, when I was growing up, people would complain that, families weren't sitting around the dinner table having a conversation. They were all sitting in front of the television watching a movie like Ghostbusters or something. But at least that generation, they were all watching the same thing together and they could talk about their shared experience. And I think what we risk in this generation because of the technology, but also I think partly because of the experience of COVID, the pandemic, which was a very isolating event for I think everyone, but especially for the younger generation who had to shift and adapt their mode of learning to online, from being in the classroom. That we can recover some sort of sense of community and just physical togetherness, so attending public events, concerts, going to movie theaters, having debates where we're not just consuming politics through social media, but we have an election year, so things like the great American tradition of town hall meetings where people from the community talk about civic issues of importance to themselves, not just Trump versus Biden, but school board meetings, town meetings, things that actually affect local citizens at the local level, I think is where democracy really matters. And so my hope is that the emerging technology, artificial intelligence, doesn't turn human beings, if you like, into almost like the domestic animals of this new species of artificial intelligent entities that govern the world. I think that's a sort of very frightening, maybe science fiction interpretation of the future. I don't think it will happen that way. I think actually I'm somewhat hopeful that people will and are reconsidering their relationship to each other and themselves as human beings. So that would be my hope, and my fear obviously would be sort of accelerated isolation. People living in a society of without shared knowledge, without shared values, without shared understanding. Not to say that everyone has to see the world in the same way, but we have to have some things in common.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor.
No, yeah.
And I think the last question: what are your what would you advise for younger generation, for people in my age, for like freshmen or for graduates of high school, 15, 16 years old, young teenage folks?
That's a great question to end with. I think, first of all, it depends on the individual. So the question, I was actually watching another podcast last night, and the question was whether you should follow your dreams, your passions, or your talent. And I think you can follow both. I think it's a false distinction between following your passions and following your talents. First of all, if you have a talent that makes you unhappy in life, then you don't want to be stuck doing the same thing. And of course, in the economy today, the model is that you move on from one job to another. You have to be flexible. You have to adapt to changing technology and changing economy. But on the other hand, if you just follow your passion, maybe you want to be the next Ronaldo or, George Clooney, but you have to also understand that, in sports or in entertainment, that the idols, if you like, are a tiny minority of 1% of, the total number of people that try and go down the route of, doing something, glamorous and exciting in that way. So again, find something that motivates you, but also that is practical. So what I would say is it depends on the individual. So I can advise a young person based on my experience as a history professor, but I also think there's actually a great opportunity for students who are interested in working with their hands to engage, in trade skills, vocational education, learn a trade. Partly because I think, in a weird way, even though we're talking about artificial intelligence, I think one of the fields that there is still a lot of demand for is things like plumbing, electrical, electricians, motor mechanics, people who fix roofs, because these are actually very difficult to automate, these skills, and they are skills that have to be learnt. And more importantly, again, through learning those trades, certainly economically, it will pay off. I think, there's a great economic demand, so these are skilled trades. But at the same time, we also have on the other end of the spectrum, maybe. So I think what I would say to the individual is don't feel obligated because of the sort of social expectations that you finish high school and therefore you have to have a 4-year degree in order to progress in a sort of traditional ladder of career expectations. But I would like to see, again, some value placed on what I teach, which is history, but more generally the kind of liberal education, humanities, traditional education. I don't think there's a distinction between the two. I think you can be a good plumber maybe and read Homer's Odyssey in your free time. But I think as well there is a pressure being placed on higher education to justify everything that we offer in terms of return on investment. Now, I think that is good from the student perspective, maybe also from the parent perspective, if the parent is paying the tuition to some extent. But I think the problem with the framing of the return on investment is that investment is very difficult to calculate in the long term because we're looking at an economy and technology which is changing very rapidly. So paradoxically, I think the skills that you might learn from, say, for example, a class in computer coding will be obsolete in a very short period of time, a couple of years, and may also have been automated. So, one of the ironies is that a lot of redundancies in the economy are being made by big tech companies like Google and, Meta, laying off large numbers of their workforce because those positions can be automated. I think one of the things that you learn through the humanities is what is sometimes described as soft skills, but I actually reject the term soft skills because I think it sort of downplays the importance of being able to think, being able to situate yourself in history, being able to understand the world based on value judgments as well as maybe just spreadsheets and formulas. And also, these are skills which are universal. So the same skills that inspired Leonardo da Vinci during the Renaissance could be the same skills that drive our students into a career in the arts or a career in history through museum management or something like that. But it doesn't have to apply directly. I mean, I think For example, the best lawyers, if you're thinking of applying to law school, get an undergraduate degree in history, because the best lawyers are the people who are creative, who think about the world through a lens of curiosity, who are skilled writers, who are able to argue a case based on logical reasoning, which is also a skill which is encompassed by philosophy, but by history, and even things like creative writing. You have you might not think that creative writing would be a valuable skill, but however you come at these disciplines, I think having the skill set is more important than having the body of knowledge, because the skill set can be applied in any number of circumstances. And I think what isn't going to change is the importance of critical thinking. I think what will change is the technological environment and the job market. So I think we do our students maybe a disservice by saying you should learn this skill because this skill applies to the job market as it exists in 2024, because the job market in 2034, 10 years from now, could be a whole different world. And so you want skills which are adaptable. Obviously, you want to learn on the job, and this is why lifelong education is important as well. And I would also say vocational education for some students is maybe a better fit. I don't necessarily believe that all students should take history at undergraduate level to get a degree in the humanities, but I think it should be accessible to everyone. So I think it's something that should also be valued by everyone. So again, what I would advise a young person would really be based on their skills, their interests, what they value as well in terms of their motivation. So there is no one answer, but what I would steer clear of is just thinking about the world as it is today is not going to be the world that it is a couple of years from now. So
thank you. Thank you so
thanks
much,
again.
Professor. Thank you.
Thanks.